Is this on, by the way?
Yeah.
I got really interested in drug law and prohibition and why drugs were prohibited. So I've now spent the rest of my time at university studying drug policy. So whilst I'm talking about it from a policy point of view, it's going to be something that's for everybody. I'm not one of these people who presents highly academic papers. That's not me. I'm not in that field. So I want to talk to you about drugs and all drugs and the role of prohibition. So for the first time in my life, I've got a slide slave down there. So can we change slides? Thank you. So we often read about drug pushers, and we kind of think of them as being evil. The evil drug pusher, the Misuse of Drugs Act, which is the key piece of legislation in this country, prohibiting drugs. It's all about, it reflects the penalties that pushers, dealers are wicked and greedy, users are weak, misguided, inadequate or ill. There's never a sense in which they're just having fun. So, onwards. And we get this kind of picture of what a drug dealer might look like. They're hanging about outside schools, they're Mr. Big, they're wearing hoodies, and that conjures up the kind of picture we have of the drug dealer. Can we go to the next one? There's no time to do your phone, you just have to sit without it. And the next one, this is another view of drug dealers. The idea that it's somehow big pharma, and that they're selling as opiate-based or opioid-based painkillers, that there's some kind of link between the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and big money, and we see it as how the drug industry creates mass addiction. That rather faint slide says that. Okay, on to the next one, thank you. But I intend to expose the real identity of the person, or what I'm going to call Mr. Big. And it certainly isn't going to be the kind of people we've just looked at. I'm not the first person to have made this discovery. We've been talking for some time about the unintended consequences of drug prohibition. And I've noted a few people. The second one down, of course, was the previous United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime. He was the chief executive, Antonio Maria Costa, and he said there's 5 unintended consequences. Peter Reuter, I think, talks about 24. So there's a variety of how you see this. Here the focus, what I'm going to talk about, is how international prohibition and those who enforce it are, in Milton Friedman's words, the drug dealer's best friend. And Witowski, he talks about if the cocaine industry commissioned a consultant, they couldn't ask for more, basically, than prohibition, because it increases the price just enough to make it chic and make a big profit for them, but it doesn't increase the price. Prohibition does not stop people using drugs, and we have to get that clear. So, prohibition has not only created a risk dividend, which means that the drug cartels are making lots of money, it's also steadily increased the size of the drug market. And we'll talk about the balloon effect in a minute. So, in order to demonstrate what I'm going to say, why do states prohibit drugs? I'm going to then say, why are supply-side policies the favoured policies? They're meant to, and how they're meant to work, and how, in fact, they increase drug use across the world and make it a much worse problem. So, why do states seek to control drugs? Well, the problem with drugs is they've got good and bad sides. It's like a hologram. They can have very bad sides, they can make people addicted, they can make people ill. But on the other hand, they have good sides. They relax people, people have recreational use of drugs, And so there's this balance between them. So states, being states, want to control us, but at the same time, they think, well, we can't ban all drugs because there might be a mob if there was a banning of all drugs. So states are inclined to think about giving us some drugs, like alcohol and tobacco and caffeine. Don't let's forget, that's a drug too. And then they seek to control how we use them. Caffeine is not controlled, but alcohol and tobacco are regulated, are controlled. And they try to develop a culture and socialisation around them, such as the idea that you don't drink when you wake up in the morning. Some of you might do, let's not go there, but anyway. So states fear their effect, and they try to stop us or control our use of them. Okay, Chris, next slide, thank you. So prohibition, the idea of prohibition was that it was to stop us using a particular menu, remember not all drugs, but a particular menu of psychoactive drugs. Now I could go into a lot of detail about why that particular menu. All I want to say, just briefly, is it's funny that the drugs that we produced in America and the Western European states were the drugs that we left legal, alcohol and tobacco. The drugs that we used across other countries in the world, opiates or opium and cannabis and coca, were prohibited. So, prohibition relies on criminal sanctions. States threaten to fine us, put us in prison, give us a criminal record. And they also rely on the development of moral sanctions, that people look at people who use drugs, whether it's cannabis or heroin, and there is a stigma attached that somehow you're a smackhead, a crackhead, all these kind of pejorative, prejudicial kind of names we give to people. So that's why we prohibit them, to stop people using them, because states want to control behaviour. So, what about supply-side policies? What are they? Well, we either mow up the crop, eradicate it, burn it. We try to interdict, which means any disruption of the supply chain from when drugs are made till they're sold on the street in Durham, shall we say. And we also try to stop people by deterring them or punishing them if they sell drugs. El Chapo is the latest sort of famous person getting the punishment. So, how should they work? The idea of these supply-side policies is basic supply and demand. If you cut off the supply, the price will go up. If the price goes up, the demand will go down. Doesn't work like that, as we've realised, because for a start, some drugs are addictive, and therefore it's not going to work. But it's not that all drugs are addictive. They're not all addictive, and not all drugs are addictive to all people. We have to remember that. Some people are more inclined to become addicted to a drug than others. And I think that's important to remember. Why are these policies then attractive? Well, I think we need, Why do governments like these policies, supply side? Well, it's easier than tackling demand because you can blame outsiders. You say the drugs coming from Mexico, as Donald Trump is saying, or they're coming from Africa, they're coming from somewhere else, Afghanistan, they're coming from Colombia or wherever. So you can blame outsiders for your problem, and if drugs are unavailable and nobody ever experiments, then addiction is not going to happen. So if you can stop drugs coming in your country, and also a lot of these policies are quite visible. You see a lot of police have just caught somebody with a boat full of this or a shed full of that, or there's so many fields in Afghanistan have been eradicated. So now I want to talk about why do these policies fail? Those are the policies, that's why we like them. Why do they fail? Well, they fail because in many countries where they're producing plant-based drugs, there is great poverty. And the farmers don't get much out of the drugs. It's the cartels that get the money, not the farmers. They are intimidated if they stop growing the drugs to grow them again. Often they have loans out to the drug cartels. And there is also fear of rebellion, that they will start supporting, say, the Taliban in Afghanistan or various terrorist groups around the world. And there is corruption, that the states where the drugs are grown very often are in the grip of the drug cartels. Mexico was a case in point, but also Colombia, Peru, etc. So how could you moderate this? How could you sort of eradicate without driving peasants to support insurgents? Well, there's two possibilities. You could give them other crops, say, produce pineapple. Well, they do. They say these things. They say produce pineapple, but how do you get pineapple when it takes 7 days to get it to market on a donkey? How are you going to do that? These places have not got infrastructure that we have. They don't have cold storage. They don't have the M1 or the M6 or whatever the nearest motorway is. So crop substitution doesn't work. So then they say, okay, alternative development. We'll build them some roads. That's good because the drug cartels can use them as well. But we'll build them some roads. But the roads and things do not solve the problem. They fail too. Why? Back comes the balloon. Every time you get heavy on drugs in one part of the country, you eradicate a field or you interdict or whatever. We're looking at eradication here though. You cause resentment, you affect the environment, because when I see things that say using cocaine is destroying the rainforest, yes, it's using cocaine that destroys the rainforest because cocaine is prohibited. And so every time you eradicate a coca field, people move further into the rainforest, chop down some rainforest. And they pour chemicals and all this because it's an unregulated industry. And it causes resentment. And anyway, you can eradicate every field with every crop that produces a drug, and people will turn to synthetics. So you're not going to solve the problem. So eradication pushes the drugs, is what we call displacement. You could alternatively develop every corner of the world and you would still have synthetics. They're produced, a lot of the synthetics at the moment are produced in China, so it's not going to affect it. So the balloon effect is when you squeeze in one area, it goes out the other. You don't solve the problem. Okay, Chris? So interdiction. Okay, we can't solve it with eradication. Let's interdict people as they're moving drugs about. They're the people who make the money. Let's get the money makers. So interdiction is any disruption. So it focuses on the cartels and the traffickers, and it applies to synthetics like ecstasy, crystal meth, etc. So it gets two birds with one stone. It doesn't work. Why? Interdiction also has unintended consequences. First of all, how do you interdict in countries that are open with planes and boats? You can't police every bit of a country's border. We know that, even in a small country like this. You can't interdict. The other thing with drugs is a small quantity is high value. Therefore, even if you're smuggling a small amount, it's worth a lot of money because of prohibition. And we now have containerization, which stops searches and so forth. And interdiction and prohibition drive innovation. People build their own submarines. People hide it, snake in the grass or grass in the snake's bed or whatever. People hide drugs. All it does is push innovation. I went to a conference where there was an undercover policeman talking. He was very, very interesting. And he was saying the drug war is a bit like the Cold War. Every time we get a new weapon against drug dealers and cartels, they get a new weapon against us. So you have to bear this in mind. And bear in mind as well that these cartels have ground-to-air missiles. They're heavily armed, and they think nothing of torturing people and chopping limbs off and so on. So interdiction also pushes drugs. Interdiction causes geographical displacement, which I'll show you in a minute, but it also results in the Hydra effect. When you chop off the head, El Chapo or Pablo Escobar, what happens is lots of mini cartels spring up. You get more cartels. You don't actually solve the problem. Or the sons of the cartel leader are fighting it out. So you then get more cartels. So interdiction also suffers from the balloon effect. And here I'm just going to give you a quick example. That in Colombia, they got rid of the two main cartels, the Cali and the Medellin cartel. And within a 5-year period, the Marxist guerrillas and the far-right paramilitaries took over the whole of the drug trade. Not only that, the weakening of the cartels led to a rise in the drug problem in Mexico. Because of interdiction enforcement across Florida, they managed to successfully stop some of the boats going over. They then transferred the route, the cartels, through Mexico. The result was the cartels in Colombia were much weaker. The cartels in Mexico became much stronger. And now we have 70,000 plus dead in Mexico because of interdiction and the desire for drugs, of course. So what you get, and getting heavy in Mexico pushes drugs. Some of these drug cartels are now operating out of Guatemala. So it pushes drugs. Sorry, sometimes I seem to be too loud. What about deterrence? Does that work? No, it doesn't work. Criminal punishment is designed as a deterrent, but it's high risk, high reward. My son is currently in prison, and he was telling me about a drug dealer we know from our hometown, and he said, oh, Martin's back to have his assets seized. And if he doesn't accept the seizure of his assets, he's got to spend an extra month in prison. He's doing 8 years. It's quite a long time, but an extra month on 8 years. Well, why would he give them 10 grand? No, that's going to be his money when he goes out. He's not going to do that. So it's high risk, high reward. It's the cost of production. You sit in prison for a while. And I don't think prison's a piece of cake, don't get me wrong. It's mainly the small guys, the little guys that get caught, the low-hanging fruit. The Mr. Bigs just run their businesses from prisons. We know they do it in this country. We know they do it everywhere. Why did they put El Chapo in an American prison? Because he can escape easily by paying off the guards in a Mexican prison. So, and again, you've got the Hydra effect, that you punish El Chapo and his sons will fight it out. You don't stop the drugs. So, drug problems are not solved, they simply move. Every time drugs transit a new country, the problem gets worse because it creates new users and more demand for drugs. Every time a country becomes a transit state, people start trying the product. So you will get more people using drugs. And there we have somebody in Afghanistan smoking heroin. So, enforcement spreads the problem, but it's actually worse than that. In 1986, Richard Kalman proposed the iron law of prohibition, that the harder you enforce prohibition, the harder drugs become. If we could go to the next slide, Chris, thanks. So, what do we get? Amphetamines become crystal meth. Coca becomes people using cocaine, and then people using crack. Cannabis becomes skunk, stronger cannabis, and spice and mamba. Major problem, spice and mamba. My son tells me that every night on the wing, somebody has to be helped by medics. Luckily, his prison's opposite the hospital. And mamba is the main cause. It is a serious problem in prisons, but it's a serious problem in towns. Because if people were smoking cannabis, if I was a prison guard, I'd be giving them cannabis. It keeps them quiet, chilled, they're going to be okay. You start giving them mamba and you've got problems, and that's what's happening. And why mamba? Because it's easier to smuggle into prisons. Here we have something from Inside Times. Yes, they actually have a Times just for prisoners across the country. And he's talking about how he's an ex-prisoner and he tried spice, but he didn't realise that the spice he tried on the street was much less strong than the spice that's now being used in prison and causing violence against prison officers and against other prisoners. Next one. Fentanyl. Fentanyl is no mystery. It's a direct consequence of market pressure. And a lot of the drugs going into America, and that's why you have a fentanyl crisis or an opioid crisis in America at the moment, a lot of the drugs now have fentanyl added. The fentanyl comes from China, it goes to Mexico. Mexico has been very, very quick to replace the marijuana market. In America, because some states have legalized marijuana, and because medical marijuana is more readily available, that people are producing it in the States. So the Mexican market is being squeezed. But because of Oxycontin and opioid crisis that's developing in America, the Mexicans have stepped in and they're producing all the heroin that's going into America. And the best way to make more money is use less heroin and more fentanyl. And fentanyl is very dangerous unless you know what you're doing. So, Richard Cowen's Iron Law of Prohibition means that the intense crackdown encourages more potent drugs. But it also increases the number of drug users. Users steadily, sometimes rapidly, increase. So we've got a situation in which prohibition causes more hard drugs to be used, or harder versions of drugs to be used, and it also increases the number of people using. So here we have I'm just referring to a couple of countries. Afghanistan, its trade has become a trail of addiction at home. They used to just use opium and opiate-based medicines. Now they're smoking it, they're injecting it. And a growing army of addicts. Brazil, traditionally a transit country, now a growing market for drugs. Mexico, the Mexican Attorney General is saying it's clear Mexico has stopped being a transit country for drugs to the US and has become an important market. I would argue it's both. It's not one or the other. It's still the transit, but it's both. And again, Guatemala, drug gangs pay their runners and hitmen with cocaine, driving a growing local market. So what happens is that you're leaving a trail of homegrown addicts in a country that's racked with poverty and crime. So 10 years ago, they used to pay their runners, the people who sort of carried the drugs around, they used to pay them 75% cash, 25% in drugs. Now they give them 100% drugs and they say you can sell the rest to make money out of it. So can you see how every time we crack down, we move drugs to another country and we increase the number of users? I want to just add at this point, I'm not anti-drugs. I don't use drugs at all, and I've had a very bad experience with heroin addiction in my family. So I'm not pro-drugs, I'm not anti-drugs. I just want to sort of explain how it works. So Iran was traditionally a transit state from Afghanistan to Turkey and then to Britain and Europe. Now it has, they increased interdiction in Iran, so the routes for drugs went through the former Soviet republics to increase with enforcement. So you've got a lot of users, high addiction rates in Iran, you've got now high addiction rates in the republics, and now it's moved to the Cape route. Drugs coming to Europe, and particularly to this country, now go round the Cape. So what happens? We now have countries in Africa which have less enforcement, they've been less part of what we call the drug war. And now you have countries like Guinea-Bissau, where the Americans describe it as a warehouse for drugs. Drugs are going through this country, and more people in those countries are using drugs. So Africa is the new big market, and it's got less enforcement, less medical facilities to deal with people who are using drugs. So a big drug problem. My students have often said to me, oh, well, if you crack down more in Colombia and Peru and places like Afghanistan and so on and so on, that drugs, there wouldn't be any production. I said, but there's the whole of Africa waiting to become the next drug continent, and it's happening now. So to make matters worse, I'm near the end if you're getting bored, to make matters worse, not only do they now use the drugs that they never used, which is fine if it's going to make them happy, but I don't think it always does. They've started using more westernized drug use. Instead of smoking opium, they are now injecting cocaine, injecting heroin. And often, you know, injecting both heroin and cocaine. It's common to do both. So, and crack. So, American drug policy, which shaped the world, I must say we all went along like sheep. So, you know, this country's got no excuses here. So, American drug policy which shaped the world, Bruce Johnson says it's nothing but symbolic, really. We all know this. I'm not some special person who can see into things that the American government can't see. They know all this. They know that it's symbolic. But I would argue that they've actually made it worse, that they have actually pushed drugs. They haven't actually they've tried to stop people using drugs, but in doing so, they've pushed drugs. They are the drug pushers. So every supply side success increases the danger of drugs by making them stronger, and increases the number of users. So it is a completely failed policy. Now, what does a drug pusher look like? Well, I would say this is what the drug pushers look like. They are Nixon's war on drugs. They are, I've forgotten his name, the guy in the Philippines who's bumping off people for drugs. They are all these people. These are the drug pushers because their policy of prohibition makes more people use drugs, and particularly in poorer countries. So I leave you to make up your own mind of what you think about prohibition. What I wanted to present to you was that it will never, ever, ever work. You only prohibit things that people want. There's no point if people want it. And as far as I'm concerned, why should the only drug that you are allowed to use be alcohol? If you want to smoke cannabis, I think you should be able to. I don't want to do them. I don't even do alcohol. Well, I did have a glass of wine last night, sorry. But occasionally, but very occasionally. But other people get a lot of pleasure out of these things. And two things that I heard earlier when I was sitting listening. One was about pharmacies. I want to remind people that it was the growing lobby of the pharmacy and the medical industry around the 1890s, 1896, 1886 onwards. It was their lobby. They wanted to be the only gateway to drugs. And it was their lobby that began this whole process of prohibition alongside the Americans and wanting to solve China's problems. So there is some further reading for those. I'm used to teaching students, you see. But if we could go, there's the next one. So thank you for listening. And if you've got any questions, you're very, very welcome to ask them. I'll answer anything. Okay. Anybody got any questions? Anybody got a question?
Any questions for Sue?
Yeah, I can't see without my glasses, and they're somewhere at the back, but please ask away.
Hi. I'm sort of one of those pizza box idealists, so I like just come up with random ideas and write them down. I was watching a Netflix program the other day on cannabis. There's quite a few that have come up lately, inside stories and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Is it possible that something such as a control centre or a quarantine centre, which was implemented in the country to process these drugs into things that are useful, could be the way forward? I mean, it secures infinite amount of jobs, and if the police were willing to give that third option to people, look, we're not going to prosecute, but everything's going to be seized, this is where it's going, and this is why you're not being prosecuted, because it's going to a good cause.
Well, I think that's possible, but I agree with you, it's slightly idealist. I think one of the things I say to my students when they debate whether we should legalise or not, I say there's no sitting on the fence here. I'm not talking decriminalisation, because decriminalisation leaves drugs in the hands of cartels. You don't know what you're taking, and you don't know how strong it is or what's it being mixed with.
Even
it's
so,
an
the black market
incremental
would still
step.
exist if that was the case. There's always going to be two markets, a legalised
Yes.
market and a black market, even
Possibly.
if it is legalised.
Possibly, yes.
So
There's
there would have to be...
people making vodka in farms, particularly where I live, down south, where there's a lot of people who make stuff and sell it illegally, and illegal cigarettes come into the country. Yeah, there will always be an illegal market. But most people, given a choice between the legal drug and the illegal drug, which they don't know what the composition is, will think, okay, I'll pay for the legal drug. I'd rather buy a vodka in a bottle that I know than buy something that somebody sells from under the desk, because you don't know whether it's going to affect your eyesight and so on. And so I always say to my students, if you're going to debate legalisation, I don't want you to say, yeah, I'd decriminalise, I'd start with decriminalising cannabis. And that's not what I think legalisation is selling it in Sainsbury's. I mean, I know, big intake of breath, I know, but you sell vodka and gin in Sainsbury's. Alcohol is the most dangerous drug known to man. It causes people to fight, it causes domestic violence. I'm not saying don't drink, I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying think about what we say to people. We say, you can buy it in the student shop, you can buy it on the motorway, where you're not supposed to drink and drive, but now you can buy. I know it helps those motorway shops to survive, but aren't we sending out the wrong message? That Gordon Brown said we were sending the wrong message when cannabis was lowered from B to a C. I guess if you said to my students, or most students in the university, did you know cannabis is now a C? We'd say they wouldn't know what we were talking about. They don't care what category these things are. It's just us. And the police can't enforce the cannabis laws anyway. So, any other questions?
One last one, if we can keep it brief, because we need to get another speaker on.
When you do, if legalisation does happen, how do you stop the issues that have happened with like big pharma, big tobacco, and even kind of alcohol companies to an extent, Richard? How do you stop that happening?
I agree, that is the problem. But I'm sure I read somewhere that Marley Gold has been a trade name that's been registered by a tobacco company for about 30 years. Yeah, it's going to happen. And when students say to me, well, will that help Afghanistan and the peasants in Colombia? No, because they'll grow it on the prairies once it's legalised. The poppies will be everywhere. We used to grow it here in Norfolk, massive poppy. We do grow poppy for opium here in this country.
People still grow it themselves.
Pardon?
People still grow it themselves around here.
Do they? I better not tell my son. Yes, I guess people do. I remember going in the kitchen once and my son was boiling something up and I said, what are you doing? He said, I'm making heroin. I said, I don't think you've got the right poppies there. But, you know, yes, why not? Why shouldn't people grow it themselves if they want to? People make their own alcohol. Why shouldn't they? Why should the state and big companies control everything?
I think once you take the money out of the equation, then it just becomes a plant you grow in your back garden. And the market disappears.
Well, it does, yes. And that is why in Spain and in the Netherlands, they encourage you to grow your own. In the Netherlands, it's up to 5 plants. In Spain, as long as it's your back garden, not your front garden, as long as you're not selling it, you can grow it. If you had a big field out the back full of it, you might get prosecuted. And I think that's fair enough. Obviously, more of you are what I would call the cannabis lobby. I'm much more wide-thinking in the sense that I'm thinking that ecstasy is a much less harmful drug than alcohol.
And on that wonderfully poignant note, I would like to, thank you very much. Round of applause. We'll be putting up links to a lot of Sue's work. Hopefully I'll actually be able to sneak this presentation from her as well, and we'll stick that to be available.
You've got it.
Oh, I've already got it.
You can give it.
Wonderful. One more time, ladies and gentlemen, for Professor Sue Bryce.
Peace out, peeps. I'm a joint. Happy 420.